My name is Silas Vance. I'm 72 years old, and if you're listening to this, you're probably looking for a campfire story about Bigfoot screaming in the woods or throwing rocks at campers. I can't give you a campfire story, but I can tell you about the winter of 1998, when I found out that the creature the world calls Sasquatch isn't a myth, but a biological reality that hits harder than a freight train. I know this because I watched one snap the neck of a 2,000-pound American bison bull and lift it over a 7-foot steel fence like it was a sack of feed. I've spent my life in the South Dakota Badlands, a place the government calls unfit for cultivation, but which I call the only honest piece of ground left in the country. For 45 years I raised bison on 3,000 acres of scrub grass and hardpan clay. I respected the land, I respected the herd, and I thought I knew every predator that walked the prairie. I was wrong. There is something else out here, something the Lakota call the Chiye-tanka, or the big elder brother. They aren't monsters. They are the shepherds of the plains, and I spent 3 terrified years helping them hide from the modern world. This is my confession. To understand what happened, you have to understand the land. The Badlands aren't like the Pacific Northwest forests where most Bigfoot stories happen. There are no thick trees to hide behind, no shadows to mask a giant. It is a landscape of violent geology, jagged spires of sedimentary rock, deep twisting ravines that cut into the earth like wounds, and miles of rolling prairie that look flat until you try to cross them and realize they are a maze of gullies and washouts. It is a place where distance lies to you. You can see a coyote 3 miles away, but you can lose a massive bull bison in a draw 50 feet from your truck. It is a land of silence, broken only by the wind that never, ever stops. In 1998, I was running a herd of about 400 head. My neighbor to the east was the Pine Ridge Reservation, and my neighbor to the west was the National Park. I was the buffer zone. I liked it that way. I didn't have much use for people. My wife had passed on 5 years prior, God rest her soul, and my kids had moved to Denver to work in offices with air conditioning. It was just me, a couple of hired hands during the roundup season, and the wind. The trouble started in late November. We had an early freeze, the kind that locks the mud into concrete and turns the grass brittle. I was out doing my morning rounds in my old Ford pickup, checking the water tanks and breaking the ice on the troughs. Bison are tough animals. They face into the blizzard while cattle turn their tails and die, but they still need water. I had a specific bull I was looking for, a massive 7-year-old male I called Ironside. He was the herd sire, a beast of an animal that weighed close to 2,200 pounds. He had a temper like a chainsaw and a head the size of a beer keg. He wasn't the kind of animal that got lost. He was the kind of animal that decided where the herd went. But for 3 days, I hadn't seen him. The main herd was bunched up in the north pasture, huddling together against the biting chill. But Ironside wasn't on the perimeter where he usually stood guard. I wasn't panicked, but I was uneasy. A missing bull usually means one of 2 things. He's sick and has gone off to die, or he's broken a fence and is currently tearing up someone else's property. Both are expensive problems. I drove the perimeter fence, 5 miles of heavy-gauge steel wire strung on railroad ties. This wasn't a barbed wire cattle fence. This was a bison fence, built to stop a stampede. If Ironside had broken out, there would be shattered posts and tangled wire. But the fence was pristine. The wire was tight. The gates were locked. I parked the truck at the edge of the Broken Leg, a deep, treacherous section of ravines on the far back corner of my property. It was rough country, barely accessible by horse, let alone a truck. The wind was howling out of the north, carrying the scent of snow. I grabbed my rifle, a .45-70 lever action that I carried for euthanizing injured animals, and started walking. The ground was hard, crunching under my boots. I walked for 2 hours, scanning the gullies with my binoculars. I saw nothing but mule deer and the occasional jackrabbit. Then I saw the birds, ravens, a thick black cloud of them, circling low over a box canyon that dead-ended against a sheer wall of sandstone. Ravens mean meat. I picked up my pace, dread sitting heavy in my stomach. I figured Ironside had slipped on the ice, fallen into the ravine, and broken a leg. I was mentally calculating the loss. Stud bulls aren't cheap, as I crested the ridge and looked down into the draw. The birds were clustered around a dark mound at the bottom of the ravine. It was Ironside. He was lying on his side, motionless, but it wasn't a fall that killed him. I slid down the embankment, the shale sliding under my boots. When I got close, the smell hit me, not the smell of rot. It was too cold for that, but the copper tang of blood. Ironside was dead, frozen solid. But as I walked around the carcass, the story the ground told me didn't make any sense. There were no tracks. The ground in the ravine was a mixture of frozen mud and patches of snow. If a 2,000-pound bull had walked in here and died, there would be deep hoof prints. If he had slid down the side, there would be a tear in the earth. But the ground around him was undisturbed except for the ravens hopping around. It looked as if he had been dropped from the sky. I knelt down to examine him. He hadn't been shot. There were no bullet holes, no exit wounds. He hadn't been attacked by wolves or coyotes. The hide was intact, save for where the birds had started pecking at his eyes. I ran my gloved hand along his spine. When I reached his neck, I stopped. The neck was twisted at an angle that made me nauseous. It was snapped, cleanly, forcefully. Now, bison fight. During the rut, they ram each other with the force of compact cars. I've seen broken ribs, gored flanks, even broken legs, but I had never seen a bull's neck snapped like a dry twig. It takes an immense amount of leverage to break the spine of an animal that is essentially a tank made of muscle and bone. I stood up and looked around, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. The silence in the canyon was absolute. The wind moaned over the rim, but down here, it was dead quiet. I scanned the cliffs above me. They were 30 feet high, sheer rock. Then I saw the fence. The perimeter fence ran along the top of the cliff. It was a 7-foot-tall game fence, heavy woven wire on steel posts, designed to keep the bison from walking off the edge. I climbed up the side of the ravine, slipping and cursing, until I reached the top. I walked to the fence line directly above where the body lay. The fence was intact. It wasn't bent, it wasn't broken, but on the top wire, the heavy steel cable that ran the length of the fence, there was a tuft of fur, dark, woolly bison fur, and directly below it, on the snow-covered ground on the outside of the fence, the reservation side, there were tracks. They weren't bison tracks. They weren't bear tracks. They were footprints. 2 of them, deeply impressed into the frozen crust, as if something incredibly heavy had braced itself there. They were massive, 18 inches long, maybe 20, wide at the toes, tapering to a heavy heel, and they were parallel to the fence. I stood there, my brain trying to process the physics of the scene. I looked at the tracks. I looked at the tuft of fur on the top wire. I looked down at the carcass of Ironside, lying 30 feet below in the ravine. The bull hadn't fallen. He hadn't jumped. Bison can jump, but they can't clear a 7-foot fence from a standstill. And he certainly didn't fly. Something had stood on the other side of the fence. Something had reached over, grabbed a 2,000-pound bull by the head and flank, lifted him into the air, snapped his neck, and tossed him over the wire like a man tossing a hay bale. I staggered back, my boot hitting a rock. I looked at my own hands. I'm a strong man. I've worked ranch labor my whole life. I can lift 100 pounds, maybe 200 on a good day. To lift Ironside, you would need a forklift. You would need hydraulics. Or you would need muscles that biology books say don't exist. I looked out across the reservation land. It was empty. Just miles of rolling prairie and scrub brush, stretching out toward the white, jagged teeth of the Badlands wall. But for the first time in 40 years, the emptiness didn't feel lonely. It felt occupied. I backed away from the fence. I didn't turn my back on the open ground. I kept my rifle gripped tight across my chest, thumb on the hammer. I walked backward until I was over the crest of the hill, and then I turned and walked as fast as my old legs would carry me back to the truck. I locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, the heater blasting, my hands shaking so bad I couldn't get my cigarette lighter to work. I didn't call the sheriff. Sheriff Miller was a good man, but he was a town man. He would look at the carcass and say, "lightning strike," or "freak accident." He wouldn't understand the tracks. He wouldn't understand the impossible leverage required to snap that neck. I drove home. The image of those tracks burned into my retinas. I poured a glass of whiskey at 10 a.m. and stared out the window at the gray sky. I knew who I had to call. Not the police, not the vet. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the tribal game warden office in Pine Ridge. I asked for Joseph Black Moon. Joseph and I had an arrangement. We shared a fence line for 10 miles. We respected each other. He was a Lakota man, about my age, maybe a few years older. He had fought in Korea, same as my brother. He knew the land better than I did, which was saying something. He was a man of few words, practical, hard-edged, and utterly devoid of bullshit. If a cow wandered onto his land, he'd call me. If a wildfire started, we fought it together. "Joseph," I said when he picked up. "It's Silas." "Silas?" His voice was deep, like gravel rolling in a drum. "Wind's picking up. You got snow coming." "I got something else," I said. "I found Ironside, my herd bull." "Dead?" "Dead." "Wolf?" "No," I said. "Joseph, something lifted him over the 7-foot wire at the broken leg draw, snapped his neck and threw him in the hole." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence that felt heavy. "You saw tracks?" Joseph asked. His tone had changed. It wasn't the tone of a neighbor anymore. It was the tone of an officer, or maybe a priest. "I saw tracks," I whispered. "2 legs. Big, too big." "Stay in the house, Silas," Joseph said. "Don't go back out there today. I'll be there in the morning. Bring coffee." "Joseph, what the hell is it?" "We call them Chiye-tanka," he said, and then he hung up. I didn't sleep that night. The wind picked up, battering the ranch house, rattling the sash windows. Every time the house creaked, I flinched. I sat in my armchair with the 45-70 across my lap, watching the tree line through the window. I kept thinking about the weight, 2,000 pounds, dead weight, lifted. I had spent my life judging animals by their size. A coyote is a nuisance, a wolf is a threat, a bear is a danger. But this was a different category. This was a power that made the fence lines, the steel and wire I had spent my life building, look like sewing thread. The next morning broke clear and cold, the temperature hovering near zero. Joseph's truck, a battered green Chevy with the tribal insignia on the door, pulled up my driveway at 7 a.m. He stepped out carrying a thermos and a walking stick wrapped in leather. He didn't have a gun. He looked at me, his face a road map of wrinkles tanned like old leather, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't ask to see the carcass. He didn't ask for photos. "Coffee?" he asked. We stood on my porch, drinking the black coffee, the steam rising in the frigid air. "You ain't surprised," I said. It wasn't a question. "I've been waiting for you to see one," Joseph said calmly. "Or see what they do. You've been lucky, Silas. Your herd is healthy. They usually take the sick ones." "They?" I asked. "You mean there's more than one?" Joseph nodded toward the west, toward the jagged wall of the Badlands. "It's a family, a clan. They migrate, just like the buffalo used to. They follow the herd. In the summer they go north into the Black Hills. In the winter, when the snow gets deep, they come down here, into the breaks, into the rough country where the wind don't bite so hard." "They ate Ironside?" I asked, my stomach churning. "No," Joseph shook his head. They culled him. He was old, Silas. He was slowing down. Maybe he was sick, and you didn't know it yet. They took him out of the gene pool. They keep the herd strong. That's the bargain." "The bargain?" I snapped, the rancher in me flaring up. "That bull was worth $5,000. That wasn't a bargain. That was theft." Joseph looked at me, a faint, sad smile playing on his lips. "You think you own them, Silas. You think because you put a tag in their ear and a fence around their grass, they belong to you. But the buffalo, they belong to the land, and the Chiye-tanka. They are the landlords. You're just the tenant." He poured the rest of his coffee into the snow. "Come on, let's go look. I need to see if they're moving on or if they're settling in. If they're settling in, we got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The hunting kind," Joseph said darkly. "There's been a helicopter flying low over the reservation border for 2 days. Black, no markings, and I found tire tracks near the south gate, expensive tires, the kind that don't belong on a ranch truck. We got in my truck and drove out toward the Broken Leg draw. As we bounced over the frozen ruts, I looked at Joseph. Chiye-tanka, I repeated. "What does it mean? Bigfoot?" Joseph snorted. "Bigfoot is a word for tourists. It's a word for scary movies. Chiye-tanka means the big elder brother. They aren't monsters, Silas. They're people. Just different, older, stronger, and they don't like it when we forget our place." We reached the ravine. The ravens were still there. The carcass was frozen solid. Joseph walked to the fence, inspecting the tracks I had found. He knelt down, touching the frozen earth with his bare hand. He closed his eyes for a moment, mumbling something in Lakota. Then he stood up and pointed to a ridge line about half a mile away, deep in the reservation territory. "There," he said softly. I raised my binoculars. At first I saw nothing but rock and scrub brush. Then one of the rocks moved. It stood up. It was dark, covered in hair that matched the color of the bison wool. It was huge. Even at this distance, I could tell it was taller than any man. It stood on the ridge, silhouetted against the gray sky, watching us. It didn't look like an ape. It looked like a man in a ghillie suit made of buffalo hide. It stood with a posture of absolute stillness, absolute authority. "That's the patriarch," Joseph whispered. "He's telling us to back off." "He killed my bull," I said, my voice shaking. "He saved your herd," Joseph corrected. "Ironside had brucellosis. I can smell it on the carcass from here. If he had stayed with the cows, you'd have lost the whole crop of calves next spring. He did you a favor." I lowered the binoculars, my mind reeling. A disease, a cull, a giant watching from the ridge. "So what do we do?" I asked. Joseph turned to me, his face grim. "We make sure nobody else finds out. Because if those men with the expensive tires find out there's a big elder brother out here, they won't see a guardian. They'll see a trophy." That was the moment it started, the moment I stopped being just a rancher and started being a conspirator. I looked back up at the ridge, but the figure was gone. Just the wind and the rock remained. But I knew we were being watched. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at my herd as livestock. I was looking at them as bait. The weeks following the death of Ironside were defined by a paranoia so sharp it felt like a physical weight pressing on my chest. I went through the motions of ranching, breaking ice, throwing hay, checking fences, but my eyes were never on the work. They were always scanning the horizon, searching the jagged silhouette of the Badlands wall for movement that didn't belong. I had spent 40 years looking at this landscape, thinking I was the master of it, only to realize I was just a guest in a house I didn't know was occupied. Every shadow looked like a shoulder. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. The prairie, usually a place of open, honest emptiness, had become a place of secrets. Joseph Black Moon became a fixture at my kitchen table. He didn't knock anymore. He just pulled his green truck up the drive, walked in, and poured himself coffee. We didn't talk much at first. We just sat there, watching the snow accumulate on the fence posts, sharing the heavy silence of men who know something that would sound insane if spoken aloud. But slowly, over mugs of black coffee that tasted like battery acid and resolve, he began to educate me. He didn't use myths or ghost stories. He spoke like a biologist describing a rare, dangerous species of bear. "They burn calories like a furnace," Joseph told me one morning, tracing a map of the ravine system on my tablecloth with a calloused finger. "A male that size needs 20,000 calories a day in this cold just to keep his heart beating. That's why they migrate. Up north in the Black Hills, they eat elk, deer, pine nuts. But when the snow gets deep, the game moves down to the plains. So the Chiye-tanka move too. They follow the biomass." "They follow my bison," I corrected him. "They follow the herd," Joseph said. "Your fence just happened to wrap around their grocery store. They don't want to hurt the herd, Silas. They need the herd. The bison are their cover, their heat source, their food bank. You saw what they did to Ironside. They took the sick one. They leave the breeding cows alone. It's a symbiosis. The bison tolerate them because they smell like the herd. They roll in the wallows. They cover themselves in dust and dung until they smell more like buffalo than the buffalo do." It made sense in a terrifying, logical way. If you were a 9-foot biped trying to survive on the open plains without being seen, where would you hide? You'd hide inside the only thing big enough to conceal you. You'd become part of the herd. The real test came in mid-December. The weatherman on the radio called it an Arctic clipper, but out here, we just called it the white wall. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the wind stopped, a sudden, breathless calm that always precedes the violence. I was in the barn double-checking the generator when Joseph's truck skidded into the yard. He didn't get out. He just rolled down the window and yelled over the rising gale. "Get in!" he shouted. "They're moving." "Who?" I asked, though I knew. "The herd and the shadows. The storm is their cover. If you want to understand what you're protecting, Silas, you need to see them when they think the world is blind." I grabbed my parka, my heavy mittens, and my binoculars. I left the rifle. Joseph had been clear about that. No guns. If we were going to get close, we had to go as witnesses, not threats. We drove out of the yard just as the first flakes began to fall, hard, dry pellets of snow that hissed against the windshield like sand. By the time we reached the back pasture, the world had vanished. The visibility was zero. The snow wasn't falling down, it was flying sideways, a horizontal curtain of white that erased the horizon. Joseph drove by instinct, navigating the treacherous ruts of the pasture track by the feel of the suspension. We were heading for the Narrows, a choke point where the ravines funneled into a wide, flat valley. This was the natural migration corridor. If the herd was moving to the sheltered canyons for the storm, they would have to pass through here. We parked the truck behind a windbreak of cottonwood trees and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and overwhelming, broken only by the shrieking of the wind outside. The temperature inside the cab began to drop instantly. We sat there for an hour, the windows frosting over, watching the white void. Then I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration in the floorboards of the truck, a rhythmic, low-frequency thrumming that traveled through the frozen earth. Thump, thump, thump. "Here they come," Joseph whispered. Out of the swirling white, the shapes materialized. Bison, hundreds of them. They were moving in a single file line, heads down, facing into the wind, their massive shoulders caked in snow. They moved with the unstoppable momentum of a glacier. I watched them pass, their dark eyes visible for a fleeting second before they vanished back into the storm. And then I saw the anomaly. In the middle of the line, flanked by 2 large cows, a shape appeared that was wrong. It was bipedal. It was walking upright, but it was hunched over, its posture mirroring the bison around it. It was covered in fur that was matted and thick, a patchwork of dark brown and black that blended perfectly with the herd. It walked with a long, fluid stride, matching the pace of the animals effortlessly. It had one hand resting gently on the back of the cow in front of it, using the animal as a guide and a windbreak. "There," Joseph breathed. "A young male. Look at how he moves." It was mesmerizing. The creature wasn't stalking the bison. It was part of the unit. The cows didn't shy away from it. They accepted its presence as if it were just another member of the herd, a strange two-legged calf that had grown too tall. Then came another and another. I counted 4 of them moving with the herd. They were huge, massive beings of muscle and hair, yet they moved with a ghost-like grace. They were survival perfection. They were using the bison to break the wind, to hide their heat signature, to mask their scent. They were drafting like race cars, conserving every ounce of energy. Then the truck shook. It wasn't the wind. Something had bumped the rear bumper. I spun around in my seat, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the frosted rear window, less than 3 feet away, a face was looking in. It was the patriarch, the one I had seen on the ridge. He was standing directly behind the truck, towering over the bed. His face was inches from the glass. I saw the moisture of his breath fogging the outside of the window. His eyes were dark, deep-set beneath a heavy, bony brow ridge. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of an old, tired man who had seen 1,000 winters. There was no aggression in them, only a profound, weary curiosity. He looked at me, then at Joseph. He recognized Joseph. I saw a flicker of recognition, a slight tilting of his massive head. He was covered in snow, his fur frozen into icicles. He looked like a mountain that had decided to walk. The sheer scale of him was terrifying. His shoulders were wider than the truck cab. He could have flipped us over with one hand if he wanted to. "Don't move," Joseph whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't look him in the eye. Look at his chin. Show him respect." I lowered my gaze, my breath catching in my throat. The patriarch stood there for what felt like a lifetime, assessing us. He was checking to see if we were a threat to the column. He was the rear guard, the protector. Then he did something that broke my heart. He reached into the bed of my truck. I heard the metal groan under the weight of his arm. He rummaged around for a second, shifting the tools and the spare tire. Then he pulled his hand back. He tapped the glass, once, gently, a sound like a stone hitting ice. Then he turned and melted back into the blizzard, disappearing in 2 strides, following his family into the whiteout. I sat there, trembling, tears streaming down my face. I wasn't crying from fear. I was crying from the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of what I had just witnessed. I had looked into the face of the past. I had seen the king of the Badlands, and he had let me live. Joseph let out a long, shaky breath and wiped the fog from the windshield. "Check the bed," he said. I opened the door, the wind nearly ripping it from my hand, and stumbled to the back of the truck. The snow was swirling in the bed, filling the voids. But there, resting on top of the spare tire, was something that hadn't been there before. It was a bison calf. It was dead, frozen, solid. It looked like a stillborn, small and perfectly formed. The patriarch had been carrying it. He had left it for us. "Why?" I shouted over the wind, staring at the frozen bundle. "Why did he leave it?" Joseph climbed out and stood beside me. He placed a hand on the calf, his expression somber. "It's a tithe," he said, "or a trade. They couldn't eat it. It died natural. He didn't want to leave it for the coyotes. He gave it to you. It's a gesture, Silas. He's paying rent." We drove back to the ranch in silence, the dead calf in the back, the blizzard raging around us. The world had changed in that hour. The lines on the map, my property, the reservation, the park, had dissolved. There was only the land and the things that survived on it. I realized then that I wasn't just a rancher raising bison for market. I was the custodian of a migration route that had existed for 10,000 years. The storm lasted for 3 days. It buried the fences, buried the roads, and buried the world in 4 feet of snow. We stayed in the house, keeping the wood stove burning, eating stew and talking about the Chiye-tanka. Joseph told me about the old days, about the stories his grandfather told him. He told me about the starving moon, the deep winter when the tribes and the big men would sometimes share the same kills because the cold made everyone desperate. He told me that they were a dying people, squeezed by the modern world, their territories shrinking, their food sources disappearing. The Badlands were their last sanctuary, a fortress of rock and mud where they could still walk unseen. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the sun came out, blindingly bright on the white landscape. The drifts were 10 feet high in places. The world looked clean, innocent, and empty. But as I stood on my porch, shielding my eyes against the glare, looking out toward the county road that ran along the southern edge of my property, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A convoy of trucks was forcing its way through the unplowed road. Big black trucks with brush guards and lift kits. They weren't local trucks. They had out-of-state plates, and pulling behind them were trailers carrying snowmobiles and what looked like portable command centers. I grabbed my binoculars. On the side of the lead truck, in gold lettering, was a logo. Apex Expeditions, Extreme Trophy Hunts. Joseph stepped out onto the porch behind me, sensing my tension. He looked at the trucks, then at me. "They're here," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Who?" "The men with the expensive tires," Joseph said. "They aren't here for the bison, Silas. They have thermal cameras. They have drones. They know something is out here. They're tracking the heat signature of the herd." I looked at the trucks, then back at the distant ridge where the clan had disappeared. The snow was deep. The tracks would be fresh. The patriarch and his family were slow, moving with the young and the old through the drifts. They were vulnerable. I felt a cold rage ignite in my chest, hotter than the wood stove behind me. I looked at the dead calf, which I had buried in the snowbank by the barn to keep it safe. I thought of the patriarch's face, the weary intelligence in those eyes. "They ain't getting them," I said, spitting tobacco juice into the snow. "Not on my land." Joseph nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. "Then we better get to work. Because those snowmobiles are faster than the big men, we need to slow them down." "How?" I asked. "We can't shoot them. That's murder." Joseph looked at the herd of bison in the north pasture, 400 massive animals pawing at the snow, restless and strong. "We don't need bullets," Joseph said. "We have the herd. A stampede leaves a lot of tracks, Silas. It messes up the snow, it confuses the thermal, and if a few thousand tons of angry beef happens to block the road, well, that's just ranching." I looked at Joseph, and for the first time in years I smiled. It was a mean smile. "I'll get the tractor," I said. "You get the gate." We were about to start a war in the snow, and the only weapons we had were 400 bison and a secret worth dying for. The invasion of my property didn't happen with a bang, but with the low mechanical whine of high-performance engines cutting through the pristine silence of the snow-covered plains. I stood on my porch for a long time, watching the convoy of Apex Expeditions trucks navigate the county road. They moved with a military precision that made my stomach turn. These weren't local boys looking to fill a freezer with venison. These were professionals, men who viewed the wilderness not as a cathedral, but as a resource to be extracted or a puzzle to be solved with enough horsepower and thermal optics. Joseph stood beside me, his face a mask of stone, watching the vehicles turn off the main road and stop at my south gate. The gate was locked with a heavy chain, a clear message in this part of the country, but I saw a man jump out of the lead truck with a pair of bolt cutters. He snapped the chain like it was licorice. It wasn't just trespassing, it was a declaration of war. "They're arrogant," Joseph said quietly, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "They think the snow makes them fast. They don't know the ground underneath. They don't know about the washouts or the alkali mud that never truly freezes. They got thermal, Joseph, I said, lowering my binoculars. If they put a drone in the air, they'll see the heat signature of the clan in 5 minutes. The patriarch is big, but he radiates heat like a wood stove. They can't hide from that. Then we have to give them something else to look at, Joseph replied. We have to give them a bigger heat signature, a chaotic one. I nodded, understanding the grim logic. We had to go down there, we had to stall them, we had to buy the sun time to set, because once night fell, the odds shifted. The hunters had night vision, sure, but the bison owned the dark. I told Joseph to head to the barn and prep the tractor, my old John Deere 4440, a massive green beast with rear tires taller than a man and a front-end loader that could lift a sedan. It was loud, it was heavy, and it was the only thing I had that could punch through the drifts in the north pasture. I grabbed my coat and walked to my pickup truck. I wasn't going down there to fight them with a rifle. I was going down there to play the part of the angry, confused rancher. I needed to see exactly what kind of tech they were packing. I drove down the long, winding driveway, the tires crunching on the packed snow. When I reached the south gate, the convoy had already set up a temporary base of operations. It looked like a military forward operating base. They had erected a heated command tent, and men in white camouflage snowsuits were unloading sleek black snowmobiles from the trailers. These weren't recreational sleds, they were mountain machines, outfitted with rifle racks and GPS mounts. A drone, a large quadcopter with a camera gimbal hanging from its belly like a glass eye, was already buzzing on a landing pad, its rotors spinning. I slammed my truck into park and stepped out, leaving the door open. I didn't bring a gun. I just brought my anger. A man in a pristine white parka, his face hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, walked toward me. He held up a gloved hand, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Vance," he shouted over the wind. "We were expecting you. Sorry about the lock. We'll reimburse you, of course." "You're trespassing," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Get your gear off my land before I call the sheriff." The man laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a laminated document. "We have federal tags, Mr. Vance. Depredation permits issued by the Department of the Interior. We had reports of a rogue bison bull, possibly diseased, attacking livestock in the area. We're here to neutralize the threat. We have jurisdiction that supersedes private property rights in cases of dangerous wildlife management." It was a lie, a polished, expensive lie. There were no reports of rogue bison because I hadn't filed any, but the paperwork looked real enough to fool a deputy. And by the time I fought it in court, the Chiye-tanka would be dead, strapped to the hood of one of these trucks. "I haven't lost any livestock," I lied, thinking of the dead calf buried in the snowbank. "My herd is accounted for." The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. He took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were cold and calculating. "Cut the crap, Silas. We aren't here for a cow. We know what's on your land. We've been tracking the migration corridor from the Black Hills for 3 weeks. We lost the signal in the blizzard, but we picked it up again this morning. A biological anomaly. Bipedal. Massive heat output. Moving with your herd." My blood ran cold. They knew. They weren't guessing. They had data. "You're hunting a ghost story," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm hunting a primate," he corrected me. "A relict hominid. Do you have any idea what a specimen is worth, Mr. Vance? Not dead. We don't want to kill it unless we have to. We have tranquilizer darts loaded with enough carfentanil to drop an elephant. We want it alive. Imagine the science. Imagine the history." He swept his hand toward the Badlands wall, toward the jagged, frozen horizon. "We're going to find it. We have thermal drones. We have acoustic sensors. There is nowhere to hide. You can either help us and be the man who facilitated the greatest scientific discovery of the millennium and get a very, very large check, or you can go back to your house and stay out of the way. If you interfere, you'll be arrested for obstruction of a federal operation." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked back to the command tent. The drone lifted off with a high-pitched whine, shooting up into the gray sky, its camera eye swiveling toward the north pasture, toward the herd, toward the patriarch. I got back in my truck and drove away. I didn't drive fast. I drove with the slow, defeated posture of an old man who had been beaten. But inside, my mind was racing. They had tranquilizers. They wanted to capture the patriarch. The thought of that ancient, noble creature, a being that had survived the Ice Age, the settlers, and the modern world, waking up in a cage, poked and prodded by scientists, was a horror worse than death. Joseph was right. We couldn't just hide them. We had to unleash chaos. When I got back to the barn, Joseph had the John Deere idling. The massive diesel engine chugged rhythmically, filling the barn with blue smoke. He had attached the hay forks to the front loader. "They know," I said, shouting over the engine. "They have a drone in the air. They're looking for a bipedal heat signature." Joseph climbed down from the cab. "The herd is bunched up in the Deep Creek draw," he said. "The Chiye-tanka are in the middle. If the drone looks down now, they'll just see a mass of heat. But once the snowmobiles get close, the herd will scatter. If the herd scatters, the family is exposed. The snow is too deep for them to run fast. The snowmobiles will run them down in the open. Then we don't let the herd scatter," I said. "We drive the herd." Joseph looked at me, his eyes widening. "You want to stampede them?" "Not just a stampede," I said. "We're going to move them down the funnel. We're going to drive 400 head of bison right down the throat of that ravine, straight toward the south gate, straight toward the trucks." It was a dangerous, insane plan. Bison are unpredictable. In a stampede, they are a force of nature, a brown flood of muscle and horn that destroys everything in its path. Driving a tractor into the middle of a panicked herd in deep snow was a good way to get killed. If the engine stalled, or if a bull decided to charge the tires, we would be crushed. "It's the only way," I said. "The heat signature of 400 running bison will blind the thermal cameras. The snow dust will blind the drone. And if we push them hard enough, they'll overrun the hunter's position. Those pretty black trucks won't stop a stampede." Joseph nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch of tobacco. He sprinkled it on the tire of the tractor, muttering a prayer. Then he looked at me. "I'll drive," he said. "You work the spotlight." We waited until twilight. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of blue and purple. The temperature plummeted. Down at the south gate, I could see the lights of the snowmobiles firing up. They were getting ready to move out. They were going to hunt under the cover of darkness. We climbed into the cab of the tractor. It was warm inside, smelling of grease and old coffee. Joseph revved the engine, the turbo whining. We rolled out of the barn, the massive tires crunching through the drifts. We didn't turn on the headlights. We moved in the dark, navigating by the silhouette of the hills. We flanked the north pasture, circling wide to get behind the herd. The bison were huddled in the ravine, a dark, grunting mass of shapes. They were agitated. They could smell the strangers downwind. They could hear the whine of the snowmobiles approaching from the south. "They're nervous," Joseph said, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "They're ready to run. They just need a push." I looked through the rear window. In the distance, I saw the headlights of the snowmobiles cresting the ridge, moving in a line, sweeping the ground with their beams. They were coming. "Now," I said. Joseph flipped the switch. The rack of floodlights on the top of the tractor cab blazed to life, casting a blinding white beam across the snow. At the same moment, I laid on the horn, a deafening, air-powered blast that echoed off the canyon walls. The herd exploded. It wasn't a gradual start. It was instantaneous. 400 animals, terrified by the sudden light and noise behind them, surged forward as one. The ground shook. I could feel the vibration through the seat of the tractor. The sound was like thunder rolling along the ground. The clicking of hooves, the deep guttural roaring of the bulls, the breaking of the crust. "Keep them moving," I yelled. Joseph gunned the tractor, shifting into high gear. We roared down the slope, chasing the tail of the stampede. The snow kicked up by the herd was a blinding white fog, a blizzard made of ice crystals and steam from their breath. We were driving into a cloud. I couldn't see the Chiye-tanka, but I knew they were there. They would be moving with the herd, matching the speed, using the chaos as a cloak. The thermal cameras on the drone would be useless now. The entire ravine was a river of heat, a washout of red and white on their screens. We pushed them hard. The herd flowed down the ravine like water, following the path of least resistance, the path that led directly to the south gate. Through the breaks in the snow dust, I saw the lights of the snowmobiles ahead. They had stopped. The hunters had realized too late that the ground was shaking. I saw the beams of their headlights jerking frantically as they tried to turn around, tried to flee. But snowmobiles are fast on flat ground. In a narrow ravine, in deep powder, turning around takes time they didn't have. The front wave of the bison herd hit the snowmobiles like a landslide. I didn't see the impact, but I saw the lights disappear. They were swallowed by the brown tide. The herd didn't stop. They trampled the machines, smashed the sleds, and kept running, driven by pure primal panic. We crested the final ridge and looked down at the south gate. The base camp was directly in the path. I saw men running from the command tent, scrambling toward the trucks. I saw the drone pilot drop his controller and dive for cover. The herd hit the perimeter fence and the base camp simultaneously. The fence vanished. The tent collapsed. The bison flowed around the trucks, slamming into the sides, rocking them onto two wheels. It was total, absolute bedlam. The pristine high-tech operation was being dismantled by 2,000 tons of angry biology. Joseph slowed the tractor, bringing us to a halt on the ridge. We watched the river of animals flow out onto the county road and scatter into the darkness of the Badlands beyond. The stampede was breaking up now, the energy dissipating into the night. "Did they make it?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my throat. Joseph pointed to the far west, away from the road, toward the deepest, most inaccessible spires of the rock wall. "Look!" I strained my eyes against the dark. At the very edge of the tractor's spotlight, moving away from the scattered herd, were four tall, dark shapes. They were moving fast, striding through the deep snow with a power that made the bison look clumsy. They weren't running in panic. They were moving with purpose. They were heading for the sanctuary of the Needle Rock, a place where no truck or snowmobile could ever follow. The patriarch stopped for a second. He turned back. Even at this distance, I felt the weight of his gaze. He raised one long arm, not a wave, but a sign. Acknowledgment. Then he turned and vanished into the shadows of the rocks. We sat there in the tractor, the engine idling, listening to the shouts of the hunters down below and the fading thunder of the herd. The snow was beginning to fall again, heavy flakes that would cover the tracks, cover the damage, and cover the truth. "It's done," Joseph said. "The snow will hide their trail by morning." "What about us?" I asked, looking at the wreckage of the Apex camp. "They're going to know we did this." Joseph put the tractor in reverse. "Let them prove it. It was a stampede, Silas. A freak accident caused by a winter storm. Bison are unpredictable animals. Everyone knows that." We drove back to the barn in the dark, leaving the chaos behind us. We had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. The modern world had knocked on the door of the Badlands, and we had answered with a sledgehammer. I knew things would never be the same. The secret was out, at least to the men with the money. But for tonight, the gate was closed, the snow was falling, and the shepherds of the plains were safe in the high rocks. The sun rose on a scene of devastation that looked less like a ranching accident and more like a battlefield from a forgotten war. The south gate was gone, flattened into the mud under the hooves of 400 bison. The Apex Expedition's command tent was a ruin of shredded canvas and bent aluminum poles, half buried in the snow. The shiny black trucks were battered, their side panels caved in, their mirrors sheared off, pushed sideways into the ditch like discarded toys. But miraculously, no one had died. Men with broken arms and concussions were huddled in the cabs of the running trucks, shivering as the adrenaline wore off, waiting for the ambulances to navigate the drift-covered roads from Rapid City. I stood on the ridge with the sheriff, a good man named Miller who had known me for 30 years, watching the paramedics load the injured hunters onto stretchers. Miller chewed on a toothpick, his hat pulled low against the glare, looking at the wreckage and then at me. He didn't ask what happened. He knew bison. He knew what a stampede looked like. But he also knew that bison didn't typically wake up in the middle of the night and decide to target a specific group of parked vehicles with laser-guided precision. "Hell of a mess, Silas," Miller said, kicking a piece of shattered drone plastic that was sticking out of a snowbank. "These fellas from the city are claiming you did this on purpose. They say you drove a tractor right down the pipe and pushed the herd onto them." I looked him in the eye, my face a mask of tired confusion. "I was out feeding, Sheriff, checking the water. You know how skittish the herd gets when the barometer drops. Maybe these boys spooked them with their snow machines. Bison don't like whining engines in the dark." Miller nodded slowly, looking at the trampled snow where the tractor tracks had been conveniently obliterated by 1,000 hoofprints. "That's what I figured. Hard to prove otherwise when the evidence is stamped flat. I'm going to write it up as a livestock incident. But these Apex boys, they aren't going to let it go. They got lawyers in suits that cost more than your combine. You better be ready for a different kind of fight." He was right. The physical war was over, but the paper war was just beginning. Apex expeditions didn't come back to the Badlands. Their equipment was destroyed, their morale was broken, and the secret they had come to find had vanished into the Needle Rock. But they sent their legal team. For the next 2 years, I was buried in lawsuits. They sued me for negligence, for reckless endangerment, for the destruction of corporate property. They tried to garnish my wages, seize my assets, and bleed me dry. They wanted to make an example of the old rancher who stood in the way of progress. I spent my savings on defense attorneys. I cashed in my life insurance. I sold the tractor. I fought them with the same stubbornness that I fought the blizzards. But in the end, money is a force of nature that even a bison fence can't stop. I was facing bankruptcy. I was going to lose the land. And if I lost the land, it would be sold at auction, likely to a developer or a hunting outfit that would pave the way for the very people I had tried to stop. That was when Joseph Black Moon came to me with the solution. It was a cold spring morning, the mud thick in the yard, when he laid a map on my kitchen table. It was a map of the Pine Ridge Reservation, but it had a new line drawn on it, a line that extended to include my 3,000 acres. "Sell it to us," Joseph said. "The tribe has a land buyback program funded by the federal settlement. We buy back ancestral lands to put them into trust. If the land is in trust, it becomes sovereign tribal territory. It becomes part of the reservation." I stared at the map. "If I sell to the tribe," I said slowly, "I lose the deed. It won't be Vance land anymore." "No," Joseph agreed, "it won't be Vance land. It won't be Apex land either. It will be the people's land. And under tribal law, we can designate it as a protected wilderness area. No hunting, no drones, no development. We can close the roads, Silas. We can lock the gate permanently." I looked out the window at the jagged silhouette of the Badlands wall. I thought about my kids in Denver who didn't want the ranch. I thought about Ironside and the calf in the snowbank. I realized that ownership was an illusion. I never really owned the land. I was just holding it for a while. The only way to truly protect the Chiye-tanka was to give the land to the only people who knew how to share it. "Do it," I said. The sale went through 3 months later. The money from the tribe was enough to pay off the lawsuits and leave me with a modest pension. As part of the deal, I was granted a life estate on the property, meaning I could live in my house and watch the grass grow until the day I died. But the fences came down, the cattle guards were pulled up, the signs went up along the county road. Tribal wilderness area, no trespassing, enforced by tribal police. Joseph was the head warden. The buffer zone was closed. The sanctuary was secure. That was 5 years ago. I'm 72 now. The arthritis in my knees keeps me on the porch most days. I don't run bison anymore. The tribe manages the herd now, letting them roam free across the expanded borders. They manage them the old way, without fences, culling only what they need. The land is healing. The grass is coming back, thick and wild, and they are still out there. I don't see them often. They are careful. They learned from the invasion of '98. They stay deep in the needle rock, in the labyrinth of stone where shadows swallow the light. But every winter, when the first heavy snow falls and the wind howls out of the north, I see the signs. I find the tracks near the barn, massive and barefoot in the snow, checking the perimeter. I find the braided sweetgrass hanging from the porch railing. They know I'm still here. They know I'm the old man who keeps the watch. Last week I felt the end coming. My chest feels heavy, like there's a stone sitting on my lungs, and my doctor in Rapid City gives me that look, the look that says, "Get your affairs in order." I decided to take one last ride. I fired up the old pickup, the engine rattling in the cold air, and drove out to the Broken Leg Draw, the place where it all started. I parked the truck and walked to the edge of the ravine. The wind was biting, tears streaming from my eyes. I looked down into the canyon, remembering the body of Ironside, remembering the power that had snapped his neck. "I'm done," I whispered to the wind. "My watch is over. It's up to Joseph now." I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. Sitting on a flat rock near the edge of the cliff, placed with deliberate care, was a stone. It was a large, flat piece of slate, smooth and dark. On the surface of the stone, someone had scratched a series of images using a sharp piece of quartz. It was a pictograph, a winter count, just like the Lakota used to make to record their history. There was a drawing of a bison. Next to it, a drawing of a storm cloud. And standing between them, protecting the bison from a line of small, stick-figure men with rifles, was a drawing of a giant. And next to the giant, drawn with crude but unmistakable reverence, was a smaller figure, a man with a cowboy hat and a rifle, standing shoulder to shoulder with the monster. I ran my thumb over the scratch marks. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a record. It was a thank you. They had written me into their history. To the world, I was just a broke ex-rancher who lost his mind and his land. But to the Chiye-tanka, the big elder brothers of the plains, I was an ally. I was the man who opened the gate when the world tried to close it. I left the stone there. It belongs to the land. I drove back to the house, parked the truck, and poured a glass of whiskey. I'm ready now. When the time comes, I won't be buried in a cemetery. Joseph promised me. He's going to take my ashes up to the Needle Rock, up to the high caves where the wind sings through the stone. He's going to scatter me on the wind, and maybe, just maybe, when the snow flies and the herd moves south, I'll walk with them one last time. My name is Silas Vance. I kept the count, and the count is good.